story of Adam and Eve is one of those stories that we have heard over and over again. One of those stories that we just think that we know. And like we have to do with stories like that, whenever we happen to read it, we don't pay too close attention because, well, we already know what it means, so what would be the point? But I gotta tell you, it's the stories like that, the stories that we think we know so well, that we really ought to pay closer attention to. Because when we do, we will find that there are a number of surprises waiting for us. For example, let me ask you a question about the story of Eve and how she takes and eats of the forbidden fruit. In that story, how many times is Satan, or the devil, mentioned? Is he mentioned 20 times, 10 times, 5 times? I mean, we all know that he is the key character in the whole story, so how many times, without looking, is Satan named in that story? No one's going to dare to say it. Well, the answer is, of course, 0. The devil, Satan, is not mentioned one time, not only in that passage, but nowhere in the entire book of Genesis. Yes, it's true that Eve does meet and talk with someone in the garden, but that someone is clearly identified as one of the creatures that God has just finished creating. Now, the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. Quite clearly it says, unambiguously, that we're talking about one of the animals that God had just finished creating. It's a serpent. It seems to be a bit of a different serpent than what we might be familiar with because, well, apparently it has arms and legs because it loses them later. But it is just a serpent. One of God's creatures. Yes, it also speaks, which would also set it apart from any serpent you might meet in the world today. But this is not treated as anything extraordinary in the passage itself. In fact, I think the underlying assumption behind that is that all of the animals in the garden were able to speak and converse with the man and the woman. Now this is, I think, a symbolic feature in the story, but it's a powerful symbol. The idea being that God created the man and his world and the woman and her world so that they might be in communication with each other. That somehow this communication was lost together with the garden. And there is in that, I think, a whole environmental sermon that we'll have to explore sometime, but not today. So there's nothing extraordinary about this ability of the serpent to speak. In fact, the only thing that sets the serpent apart from any of the other creatures that God has made is that he is described as being crafty. And I know that that word crafty has a bit of a negative connotation in English. Oh, that's a crafty fellow. But you need to understand that in the original Hebrew language, the word that appears there does not always have a negative connotation. In fact, the same word is translated a number of times in the book of Proverbs, where it is translated as prudent, in very approving tones. So what I'm saying is, there's nothing in the text that necessarily marks the serpent as being wicked or evil. There's nothing on a symbolic level that should make us think that he is supposed to be evil either. The serpent in the ancient world, including in the ancient Hebrew world, was most commonly seen as a symbol of wisdom, knowledge, learning, and healing. We still use that symbol to this very day. What is that symbol? of two snakes twirled around a staff. It is called the caduceus, and it is a symbol of learning, wisdom, knowledge, and also healing, often used as the symbol for a medical doctor. So there's nothing in the text that would indicate that this serpent is evil, or that he is some sort of supernatural being or fallen angel or anything like that. He's just a serpent, one of God's creation, rather intelligent and crafty, but just a serpent. And he comes on the scene and he begins to ask some rather inconvenient questions. Questions that no one else has dared to ask. Did God really say that you cannot eat of any tree in the garden? And then the serpent goes on from there to state something that in fact turns out to be completely true. When Eve explains to the serpent that if they eat of a certain tree in the center of the garden, they will die, the serpent replies, "You will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And that turns out to be true. They eat of the tree, and they do not die. Now, I know that you can look at that and say, well, yes, they don't die literally right away, but there may be a sense in which they die spiritually or they lose their immortality. Fine. But still, on that literal level, what the serpent says is true. They eat and do not die. Whatever else you want to say about the serpent, he is living in the fact-based community. So all of this stuff that we've piled onto the serpent, we've turned him into the devil, we've turned him into Satan, we've decided that he must be evil. None of that's in the text. It's in later tradition, it's even in later parts of the Bible, but it's not in the text itself. Which leads me to think, well, maybe there's a different way to understand the text. That maybe it's not just a story about temptation and sin, but it's about something else. Maybe it's not just the story of a weak-minded female being manipulated by a crafty serpent. Maybe it's a story about a choice being made. And yes, it is a choice that has a number of negative consequences, and yet, at the same time, there is no indication that Eve does not make this decision with full knowledge of what she's doing. It's a choice. Now, the immediate consequence of this choice, of course, is the loss of the garden. The loss of this place that is a place where everything is provided for them. Where they don't have to make any decisions. They don't have to make any choices. It's all just provided there for them, and they lose that. I think it kind of represents childhood in a sense. Childhood is a time where everything's provided for you. I mean, that's what your parents are there for, to give you what you need, to make those decisions for you, to tell you how you ought to behave. But as you grow up, you begin to take control of your own destiny. You begin to make your own choices. You begin to know for yourself what's right and what's wrong. And when that happens, when you get to that point in your life, you can no longer live in the garden, in that place where everything is provided for you. You must leave. And that's what it seems to represent. Now, there are a number of consequences that come out of this, and God comes on the scene. He walks with them in the cool of the evening, apparently, and when God arrives, they're not there, and God just lays out the consequences. You've made this choice. This is now what happens. There are consequences for the serpent, for example. The serpent loses its limbs. and has to crawl on its belly, and that's a pretty tough break for the serpent. But I'm not overly concerned with him, because it's Eve's choice. And Adam chooses to go into it with her. What does it mean for them? How does it work out for them? Well, the first consequence for Adam is this: cursed it is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you will take it. So the consequence for the man is work. Hard work. This is essentially the same thing as being expelled from the garden. Losing that place where everything's provided for you, where you don't have to struggle for anything. From now on, he will have to work. He will have to earn his living, and yes, it will be difficult. It will be hard. But there's also a promise in that, I think. The promise if he works hard, if he strives well, he will be able to prosper. The consequences for Eve are laid out very specifically and connected to her ability to bear children. God says this to Eve: I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And I know that I'm in absolutely no position to say anything about labor pains. I am not a fool. And so I will not attempt to say that it was a fair trade to trade off labor pains for this ability to know the difference between good and evil. But I will say this: in some ways, labor pains are an inevitable consequence of being that kind of people, of being the people who reach out for wisdom and knowledge and understanding. Because, of course, you know, the number one reason why human labor pains are so hard, so severe, is simply because the human head is far too large. It is too large to comfortably fit through the birth canal, and so great pain is the result. And of course, head size is connected to brain size is connected to intelligence. The bottom line is simply this: you could not have a species of animal that had that ability to think, to reason, to make its own choices and make its own way in life, that did not give to its mother extraordinary pain at birth. It's an inevitable connection. There's one other consequence that is maybe a little bit more subtle, but is in many ways, I think, the most important one. The choice that the man and the woman make to eat of the fruit does something, disrupts something in their relationships. For we are told that when they are first created, when they are placed in the garden, that they are together and that they are naked and they are not ashamed. And I think the point of that is, it's about their relationship. That they are able to be there with each other and be completely open, totally who they are. They don't have to cover up, they don't have to hide. They are in complete relationship with each other. And we see the same thing in their relationship with their Creator. This is symbolized by the habit that God apparently has of walking with them in the garden in the cool of the evening. But the first thing that happens as soon as they reach out their hand and take the fruit of the tree of knowledge is that these relationships are disrupted. First thing they do is they realize that they are naked. And the result of that, their immediate response to that is to do what human beings have been doing ever since: hide, cover up, pretend to be someone that they are not. And then when God comes on the scene, when God arrives for his regular walk in the cool of the evening, their response is the same: to hide themselves from God, just as we like to hide ourselves from God, pretend to be who we are not with God, because we're afraid that God will reject us. So this disrupts their relationships. And in some ways, this is, yes, probably connected to this whole idea that we are beings that reach out our hands and stretch out for knowledge and understanding and the power to make our own decisions in life. Because it means that we struggle in this life. It means it introduces fear into our relationships. Fear that someone else might reject us or judge us. So we hide. We cover up. We pretend to be who we are not, just to seem acceptable. And for me, this is the greatest, the most difficult consequence in this whole story. Because I don't necessarily think this whole idea that we need to strive and work for things in this world is necessarily all bad. For in that striving and working for things, we find meaning and purpose for our lives, and we need that. But this idea that we need to hide ourselves and cover up and wear masks with each other, that we need to hide and cover up and wear masks with God, that introduces so much pain and struggling into our lives and our relationships. That's the most dangerous consequence. The good news is this: God does not leave them there. God does not just abandon them in their fear and their shame and everything they're feeling. God reaches out to them. Initially, symbolically, with furs and skins that they can wear. But God continues throughout history to reach out to us through prophets, through teachers, showing us the better way to live. And ultimately, by sending his own Son to demonstrate to us what God's love truly looks like, what God's acceptance truly looks like. God reaches out. That is the good news. It is a choice. To be who we are, to reach out for wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, there are consequences to that. But there is also a God who cares and loves. Let's take a few moments in silence.